Hello students, after Bernard Shaw, we are to take up George Orwell and his essay Politics and the English Language. So George Orwell, he was born in 1903 and he died in 1950. So the period that he was active as a writer was the period known as the era of violence. Specifically 1898 to 1945, this is the period which is termed by most of the historians as the era of violence. And it is believed that the seeds of violence and dehumanization that were sown in the 19th century saw its blossoming in the form of the two world wars. And it was a period of large-scale destructions, frustrations, violent killings, and pessimistic annihilations. Though it was also a period of tremendous scientific and technological advancements. There was a rise of the revolutionary movements of fascism and communism, which led towards the so-called monolithic one-party state. The England to which Orwell returned in 1927 from Burma was a country called capitalism in decay. Class bitterness, unemployment and depression, these were certain major issues then, from where he derived his familiar vocabulary and visual images. After the Second World War, Orwell saw that things started changing. German and Italian fascism was defeated by almost 1945. By 1947, the major features of British imperialism, the one with which he was closely associated, was also gone. India became independent and it got partitioned. Burma was also independent and these were out of the Commonwealth. Europe had almost lost 25 million soldiers and 24 million civilians during the war. But still Orwell felt that events seemed to continue to run in the same pattern as the age of violence. Another aggressive totalitarianism was apparently building itself up in Europe, felt Orwell. And this is what he writes about in his utopian novel 1984, which was written in 1949, more so as a warning than as a prophecy. George Orwell was the pseudonym of Eric Arthur Blair. He was born at Motihari in Bihar in 1903 to Richard Wolmesley Blair and Ida Mabel Limousin. But after the first 4 years of his life in India, he left for England along with his mother and settled there at a place called Henley-on-Thames. Whereas his father, Richard Blair, he continued to work in India until his retirement in 1912. So meanwhile there in England, Orwell went to the public school at Eton, where Aldous Huxley was teaching him English and French. But Huxley didn't have much of an influence on Orwell, though Eton in turn did have was instrumental in having a shaping influence on Orwell. Orwell was a voracious reader, and by the time he was 11, he had completed reading Gulliver's Travels, and by the age of 18, he had read the complete works of Shaw, Galsworthy and H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells did have a very strong influence on him. Later, he appeared in 1922 in a competitive exam held for the selection of officers to be trained for the Burmese police. And he was selected for that. He joined the Indian Imperial Police and served in Burma from 1922 to 1927. Burmese Days, that is an autobiographical, or considered to be an autobiographical novel of his, It records his bitter experiences of a hard-hitting, ever-contemptuous condemnation of British imperial administration and administrators, written under the pain of disillusionment and frustration that ultimately led him to resign from his post of an assistant superintendent of police. And that's why after 1927 he returned to England. So this autobiographical novel has the central character Florrie as an English timber merchant in Burma of British imperial rule. So here this central character, he realizes the hypocrisy of British imperialism. He realizes, or he comes to know about the values of his colleagues, which are shallow, which seem to him to be shallow and narrow, and he wants to recreate the Burmese national character and return the country to its primitive culture. But the native politicians also, he comes to know that they do not want it to be so. So under the pressures of the system, he deteriorates, and because he comes to realize that the British imperialism, which he had been brought up to believe in its righteousness and honesty, ultimately he comes to know about its hollowness and its hypocrisy. All the values, they lose their validity for him, and slowly he disintegrates, and ultimately he commits suicide, and this action of his being his terrible protest against his failures. So this Burmese Days, the autobiographical novel, is full of pain and frustration. During the Second World War, he joined the BBC. Afterwards, he used his BBC experiences as the basis for the bureaucratic Ministry of Truth in his novel 1984. 1984 is the novel that he wrote in 1949. So it was the last novel written by Orwell. So it is a kind of a record of Orwell's values and beliefs and the things he feared and hated. So this novel contains a complete imagined world, a political nightmare made actual and stated very ordinarily. So what Orwell himself called this book a utopia in the form of a novel. So what Orwell means is that his novel should be treated as a warning, not as a prophecy. But here in this novel, he states, or he writes about the totalitarian government and the totalitarian system, which he detests. With the great success of his novel Animal Farm, that was published in 1945, which is one more, or it is a very popular novel, which is a kind of an extended fable with a distinct political purpose, and the book is an attack on Russia and the Russian Revolution. It was published in 1945, and with the success of this novel, a great amount of money flowed in for the first time in the life of Orwell. In the last days of his life, he was suffering from tuberculosis, but he was to move on to, or rather he was planning to move to Switzerland, but on the very first night that he was to leave for Switzerland, he had a brain hemorrhage and he died of it on January 23rd, 1950. He wrote 6 novels, 7 essays, non-fictional and autobiographical works. So about the essay Politics and the English Language, it was published in the Horizon in April 1946. Between the years 1944 and 48, Orwell was obsessed by the problem of political writing. He was with Reynolds editing an anthology of political pamphlets from the past called British Pamphleteers, and he believed, or he came to realize about the fact that in their language there was certain sincerity and authenticity which could not be matched by the prose of his time. The present political chaos is connected with the decay of language, and that one can probably bring about some improvement by starting at the verbal level. So there is decay of language in the present day prose, he believed, and that's why it lacked sincerity and authenticity, and something must be done in order to improve upon this decay that has or that is causing degeneration to the present day language. E.M. Forster comments about him: Orwell was passionate over the purity of prose, for if prose decays, he believed that thought decays, and all the finer roads of communication are broken. So there is a direct link between the language and thought. Liberty, he argues, is connected with prose, and the bureaucrats who want to destroy liberty, they tend to write and speak badly. So this essay, Politics and the English Language, it deals with the corruption of the English language because of its use for political purpose, where it loses its plainness, simplicity, sincerity, truthfulness, clarity, and the need is for restoring to it its original purpose and quality of serving as an instrument for expressing and not for concealing and preventing thought. So there should be clarity of thought, simplicity and truthfulness in the language and in thought as well. The language of free men must be candid, straightforward, vivid and truthful. Orwell is here not considering the literary use of language, but he is only talking about its political use. So he is talking about political language and the decay of the political language. He believed that and constantly he insisted upon the fact that there was a close connection between the decay of language and the stifling of freedom, as is the case of a totalitarian state where clear writing and clear thinking are impossible. Those who rely on and take refuge in vagueness do so because they have some hidden agenda to propagate. They lack intellectual honesty, and there is a gap between their real and declared aims, and that's why he connects vagueness and obscurity in language particularly with fascism and totalitarianism. Immoral politics, he believes, certainly affects language adversely. Political language can make falsehood appear like truth. So the essay Politics and the English Language, he starts with a statement: most people who bother with the matter at all would admit that the English language is in a bad way, but it is generally assumed that we cannot by conscious action do anything about it. Our civilization is decadent, and so is our language. And he says, now it is clear that the decline of a language must ultimately have political and economic causes. It is not due simply to the bad influence of this or that individual writer. That is, the individual writers, they do not have a major role to play in the decline of a language. The decline of a language is caused because of political and economic reasons. And he says, but an effect can become a cause, reinforcing the original cause and producing the same effect in an intensified form, and so on indefinitely. So the effect can become the cause and further intensify the effect. And he tries to explain it out through an example. A man may take to drink because he feels himself to be a failure. So his failure is the cause, and he starts drinking. This is the effect. And then fail all the more completely because he drinks. And now his drinking becomes the cause, and because of this cause he fails all the more. So the effect is intensified. It is rather there is interdependency. It is rather the same thing, he says, that is happening to the English language. It becomes ugly and inaccurate because our thoughts are foolish, but the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. So there is a connection between the thoughts and the language. And as the thought is, so will be the language. So if thoughts and ideas to be expressed through a language, they are slovenly or ugly, then the language is bound to be ugly. And that's why there is an intimate connection, he says, between thought and language. The English language, he says, is in a state of decay. It has become ugly and inaccurate and slovenly because the thought it expresses is foolish and ugly. But he says the point is that the process is reversible. We can bring an end to it. We can correct it. Modern English, especially written English, is full of bad habits which spread by imitation and which can be avoided if one is willing to take the necessary trouble. That we have bad habits. In our language we have adopted to certain bad habits, and repeatedly we are imitating those very bad habits, and that's why this decline in the English language continues. But we can put a check to it, we can make amends, and we can rectify the language that has degenerated. If one gets rid of these habits, one can think more clearly, and to think clearly is a necessary first step towards political regeneration. And there could be political revival. If we have a better language, then we could bring about better thoughts, or we can have expression or give expression to better thoughts, and that would be bringing in political rejuvenation, political regeneration. So in the course of his essay he picks up 5 passages, and he says that these passages he has picked up because they are especially bad. So bad prose is used rather in these passages, and he discusses these passages, and finally he comes to the point that politics affects language adversely, and this becomes the main subject of his essay, that the corruption of the English language is because of its use for political purpose, and there is a need for restoring the quality of plainness, simplicity, clarity to the English prose, so that it is rejuvenated, it is revived back, and in turn political thought, political writing would also be revived back. And while he is looking into these picked up 5 passages, he comes to the point that their modern writing, especially political writing, is bad because of a number of reasons. There are certain defects, and he enumerates these defects as dying metaphors, operators of verbal false limbs, pretentious diction, stale similes, full of pretentious diction, that is full of archaic foreign words, long abstract words, meaningless words that are used, and these defects, they mar the quality of good writing. So these should be discarded for the sake of concrete, better, clear, simple prose writing. So the first defect that he enumerates is the dying metaphors, and he says that the stale images and figures of speech, they are rendered effectiveless. They have lost their effectiveness. A newly invented metaphor helps a thought by evoking a visual image, but a dead or stale metaphor like iron resolutions, by and large, it has lost its evocative power. Many of the dying metaphors are used without the knowledge of their meaning. Some metaphors now in use they are twisted out of their original meaning. So the original meaning is not known, but they are just being repeatedly imitated by the present writers. The use of such metaphors shows that the writer is not interested in what he is saying. He is just blindly repeating or imitating the uh, repertoire of available metaphors to him. The second defect that he enumerates is the operators or verbal false limbs. These save the trouble of picking out appropriate verbs and nouns, and at the same time they pad each sentence with extra syllables which give it an appearance of symmetry, he says. And these simple verbs, they are eliminated. Instead of being a single word, a verb becomes a phrase made of a noun or adjective tagged on to some general purposes. The passive voice is used in preference to the active, and noun constructions are used in place of gerunds. So all these, he says, are defects which need to be rectified in order to render the prose effective. Pretentious diction is another effect. So this is in order to bring about an impression or give an impression of culture and elegance, these Latinized words or foreign words, they are used, and bombastic words, big words, they are used in order to show the pretentious knowledge of the writer, but they do not have much of an effect, and these need to be avoided. Meaningless words in certain kinds of writing, particularly, he says, in art criticism and literary criticism, it is normal to come across long passages which are almost completely lacking in meaning. Words like romantic, plastic, values, human, dead, sentimental, natural, vitality, as used in art criticism, they are strictly meaningless, in the sense that they not only do not point to any discoverable object, but they are hardly ever expected to do so by the reader. So they do not have any effect whatsoever. They have lost their meaning. They have no meaning, or have several meanings for that matter. So this tendency of modern prose is to drift away from concreteness, and this needs to be avoided in order that the modern English prose is rendered concrete and better. So after enumerating the defects of modern English prose, he gives us the duty of a scrupulous writer. What should be the duty of a careful writer? In every sentence that he writes, he will ask, or he should ask himself, at least 4 questions. What am I trying to say? What words will express it? What image or idiom will make it clearer? Is this image fresh enough to have an effect? So whether he is making use of a fresh metaphor, fresh image, or that would evoke a fresh image. And he will probably ask himself 2 more. Could I put it more shortly? Have I said anything that is avoidably ugly? But you are not obliged to go to all this trouble. But before this, you can shirk it by simply throwing your mind open and letting the ready-made phrases come crowding in. But it is not very feasible for a writer to do so, because there are so many ready-made phrases, there are so many ready-made dying metaphors, they are available to him to his excess, that he, without paying much attention to his own thoughts, his fresh thoughts, he just makes use of them. They will construct your sentences for you, even think your thoughts for you to a certain extent, and at need they will perform the important service of partially concealing your meaning even for yourself. It is at this point that the special connection between politics and the debasement of language becomes clear. So that's why the debasement of language has been made possible, because of this modern political writing, which is a bad writing, because of the expression of a kind of a party ideology by a writer. And for this he makes use of inflated style, and that's why he does not become a careful writer, and he does not put these 4 plus 2 questions to himself. Before that, before putting these questions to himself, he just, without giving a second thought, starts constructing his sentences, which come automatically to him, because there are so many ready-made phrases and dying metaphors already available. The inflated style itself is a kind of euphemism. A mass of Latin words falls upon the facts like soft snow, blurring the outline and covering up all the details. The great enemy of clear language is insincerity. When there is a gap between one's real and one's declared aims, one turns, as it were, instinctively to long words and exhausted idioms. So this, he says, that political writing is full of roundabout words or diplomatic words which are vague, and they show insincerity, however soft they might appear to be. So this indulges in a kind of mild expression for something that is disagreeable. So political writing, it indulges in something that is mild in expression. Though it is disagreeable, we can present it in an inflated style, in a softer way. Just as snow falls on the whole ground and covers it everywhere, likewise the language of political writing, full of inflated style, full of softness, full of euphemism, this is so designed that it abounds in Latin words and phrases, and which are not readily understood by common people. They cover it wholly. Consequently, the design is not known to the people, and the outline, it gets indistinct, blurred, and the details are covered up. The style becomes inflated and insincere and affective. So insincerity is the greatest enemy of clear language. So this passage of inflated style that he has referred to here is, or it gives an idea of what standard English in Orwell's opinion should be. Insincerity, false utterances, pomp and show, roundabout expressions, foreign words, meaningless words, they only add to the inaccuracy, insincerity of language and make it cumbersome, he says. And in order to be accurate, precise, clear, simple, insincerity must be dropped. So Orwell, he is an advocate of simple, accurate, graceful, clear prose. And for this, he says, or he lays down certain rules that need to be followed. I think the following rules will cover most cases. Never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you are used to seeing in print. So whatever are often in use, you should avoid using those figures of speech or those dying metaphors. Stale similes. Never use a long word where a short one will do. So longer words should be avoided in preference to the shorter ones. If it is possible to cut a word, redundant words should be dropped. Always cut them. Never use the passive where you can make use of the active. Never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. So the foreign words, the Latinized words, the inflated style that needs to be dropped out in order to make your speech or your prose simple, unplotted, unpolluted. And after all these, after these 5 rules, he says that break all rules, or any rules, any of these rules you can easily break in order that your prose is rendered fresh. These rules sound elementary, he says, and so they are, but they demand a deep change of attitude in anyone who has grown used to writing in the style now fashionable. So the prose style that is fashionable today is in bad shape, and it needs to be changed for the better. So we have seen politics comprises of lies, folly, euphemism, evasions, and in order to express all these, a writer who employs a language, he always uses that language in an artificial, decadent, unnatural manner, so that thought, because the political thought is corrupt, it corrupts language as well, because language also makes use of ready-made phrases that are used by the writer automatically. So political language, and with variations, this is true of all political parties, he says, or from conservatives to anarchists, all parties, they use this bad political language that is corrupt, is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable through euphemism, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. One cannot change this all in a moment. So all cannot be changed in one fine day, it cannot be changed. But one can at least change one's own habits. Slowly we need to change our habits, and from time to time one can, even if one jeers loudly enough, send some worn out and useless phrase, some jackboot, Achilles heel, hotbed, melting pot, acid test, veritable inferno, all these often used phrases, if we can drop them out someday, at least one of them, at least some of them which appear useless to us, or other lump of verbal refuse. So these rubbish, the verbal rubbish, the verbal garbage, the verbal worthless phrases, worthless words, if we are able to throw them into the dustbin where it belongs, then there would be the cleansing of the modern prose, modern English prose would become, or would start rather. So when we would start cleansing the language, our political thought would also improve upon. So this is what he has to say, that in order to improve upon political thought, we need to improve upon the language that has declined, or that is bad, that has been rendered ugly. It needs to be refined, it needs to be rejuvenated, it needs to be regenerated, in order that political thought also, or political language also, becomes rejuvenated, revived.